Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Coach Replay Show. I'm your host, Cory Camp, and today I'm excited to have on our call Dr. Carol Chanter to talk a little bit about coaching partnerships, how we collaborate, how we kind of instill that collaboration in our campus work and support that. So I love this. I love the title of our episode today, which is Creating Joyful Teachers Through Structured Coaching, and Leadership, and Collaboration. So I think that is awesome. And Carol, first, it's your first time on the show. So tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Cory. And it's my pleasure to be here with you today. I really feel like my background is a true treasure and gift to me because I've had the fabulous experience of kind of walking in a lot of people's shoes. So I was a teacher, and I've taught at pretty much every level, pre-K, elementary, middle, and high school. I was a coach. And then I went into school leadership, assistant principal, and now I work in professional learning. I lead a professional learning organization at Scholastic. And so I kind of have just had the benefit of seeing things through different eyes and understanding each person's role and how it feels to be on both sides of the role, the coach, the coachee, the leader, the outside organization that might be coming into the school. So it's a real gift. I hope to be able to share some of that with you today.
Yeah, you and I have similar backgrounds. I only did some interim experience as campus administrator, but was at the district level, and then also that regional and that outside support. And there at Scholastic, you really do run an amazing team of professional learning facilitators, specialists, coaches. They're pretty top notch. So it's always exciting to get a chance to work with you all here. So tell us a little bit about, and I do think there's so much benefit in having been on both sides of that, right? So, I love that idea of kind of being able to have been in other people's shoes, or, sat in their same seats, because I think that draws a lot, especially when we're talking about growth as educators, which, being an educator is a really vulnerable thing, right? We internalize the fact that we are educators. It's who we are down to the core, which can make professional learning and growth, especially when we need it the most, kind of a difficult thing. Coaching is one of the most powerful professional learning models that we can engage teachers in, but it's also one of the most vulnerable. Sometimes it's because of the stigmas that come with coaching and the misconceptions that it's, only for those who are really struggling. It's that deficit model. But other times it's just, letting someone else into your classroom with your kids and really being able to open up to them. So I love this idea of, and this is kind of the approach I take into my coaching as well, kind of thinking of that coaching as a partnership. So I'd love for us to start with this coaching partnership concept. Why is this essential for really any kind of success in the coaching that we're doing?
Yeah, I think, today's schools are a real example of, because there's so many things happening in our world and in our society that compete for time. And so there's a tendency for everyone to kind of run to their corners and do what they have to do in the classroom, in the school office, right? In the coaching, whatever the coaching role is. And we often don't really take the time to create this partnership. And I like to think of the concept of a triangular relationship, right? Between the coachee, the coach, and the building leader, the administrator, the leader. And we just, if any one of those points of that triangle is not in sync, if they're not aware of their role in the coaching partnership, if they're not aware that they are an equal partner, that they are equally responsible for giving and receiving feedback, then the system kind of breaks apart, right? It falls apart. And we've got to take time, and whether the coach initiates it, or whether the teacher initiates it, or whether the leader initiates it, to say, hey, we are partners in this. And so let's get together and develop some key understandings about how this partnership works, because the synergy that you'll get from that, the results in student learning outcomes, will far exceed anything that you try to kind of rush in and do by yourself, kind of like, I'm just going to get it done. And you really have to take the time to have that partnership going in.
Yeah, I think you bring such a real point to any kind of professional learning. I think where we get these low return on investment, low impact professional learning exercises, even sometimes with coaching, which we know is supposed to be, high impact, it is often a result of that lack of kind of setting a good foundation. It's oftentimes professional learning is, well, we'll just bring coaching to our teachers. They'll do some coaching. A coach will coach them, and they're going to have this impact. Well, that's really only looking at, you mentioned feedback. Everyone's responsible for giving and receiving feedback in that triangle. And feedback's a process. It's not just something that I go and I give you feedback and that's supposed to change the world, right? It really has to be this back and forth process. And I also believe in my coaching that I should be learning and growing alongside with my teachers, because they are giving me feedback and I'm receiving feedback from them. And it really is this relationship, and that campus leader also has to be a part of that so they can support the work that we're doing. And especially as a coach coming from another organization, right, that kind of hired as that consultant coach to come in, that building leader partnership with alongside that teacher and the coaching that we're doing is so valuable. They're there more often. They're kind of boots on the ground in the building every day. And we don't have that advantage whenever we're coming from an outside institute. So it's so powerful for sure.
Absolutely.
So then how do we begin to build that? I mean, oftentimes I hear, with the building leaders that I'm working with, well, we hired a coach and it's just really not working. And, it's kind of all laid on that coach, or that coach feels like they've got to do everything and they don't want to bother their building administrator. Teachers are kind of, well, I was chosen to be coach. They don't always know that they can reach out. So how do we start to build that collaborative coaching culture in our building or in a district that we're working in?
Yeah. So there's actually, this is something I learned a few years ago. So probably a decade ago now, but there's a whole science around implementation. And no matter what you're implementing, there are research-based ways to do it. And again, you can see this, demonstrated across many, many schools and districts. We find something great we're going to do, whether it's a coaching initiative or a new curriculum or a new behavior management strategy or some type of equity project. And we jump in, and many times we don't get the results that we wanted because we're not actually following the implementation science. So something that implementation science tells us is to start with a team, that it's their job to really make it happen, right? Somebody's got to be responsible beyond an individual for making something happen. So if you're wanting to implement and create a coaching culture, you really need to establish a leadership team consisting of that building leader, the coach, the teacher representatives, right? And perhaps even community representatives. But they know that their job is to build a coaching culture. You might call it a learning culture, right? Where we're all again coming back to that idea of being learners. You may have heard the leaders of buildings referred to as chief learner, right? And they should be,
Yeah.
right? Coaches as well. And so I think if you begin with that team and regularly meet with that team, that puts you a long way down the road in being able to build this culture. Because that team can begin to define terms, help make sure there's common understanding of expectations of the roles of the coach and the teacher and the leader. Goals is an important one. You mentioned before competing priorities for coaches, and coaches can't coach everything. So determining, looking at your data, letting that team decide what are we really going to target for this year. So I think those things are important. And then also this idea of modeling that everybody, including the leader, becomes a model of this learning culture, this coaching and feedback culture. So taking advantage of times during staff meetings and other professional learning opportunities where the leader is actually using the words of generative thinking. I noticed, I wondered, right? They might give an example of when they were coached and how that impacted them. But I think when teachers see leaders and even coaches model that language, that behavior, then they're better able and ready to embrace that coaching culture.
Yeah, it really is kind of leading by example, leading by doing. And I definitely can resonate with that idea, because in the organizations, the districts and the buildings where I've supported teams who are implementing video enhanced coaching, or even just video reflection with teachers just recording and watching themselves and using that evidence to create personal growth plans for themselves, it really it catches on the fastest and has the most success when those building leaders really take that personal accountability and say, some of them will even record a staff meeting or a team meeting that they've led and, say out loud, I'm recording this because I'm going to reflect on it and I plan to make changes, or I'm going to share it with you and I'd love your feedback. And then the next time they meet, they say, I noticed I received some comments, or, I had seen this as I watched that video back. And so this is the change I'm making. And just kind of saying that out loud then can just kind of start to really ignite that kind of a culture, that shift in the culture, if it needed that, to being able to do that. So it really is powerful when, as leaders, we don't just support by saying, but we also support by doing. And that can be hard for some of our leaders, right? Where, especially if they themselves haven't really dove into that type of learning, to be the one to kind of go first and lead by example can be hard, but that's okay, right? Learning should be messy. It should be outside of our comfort zone. And it should involve lots of reflection and collaboration, and just iterative moving along. So this idea of generative thinking, I know we're going to talk a little bit about that here shortly, but I think that's really powerful.
I love how you describe that. That's exactly right. Being vulnerable, being willing to share your vulnerabilities. And so we embrace that culture of we're all learners. We're all on a journey, right? We're going to make mistakes. I'm going to make a mistake as your leader. I'm going to make mistakes as your coach, right?
Right.
And so it's okay. That's how we grow. And we got to get rid of that spirit of fear and build that spirit of
Yeah. And then also just being, transparent about, like, it is work. Learning is work. Change is work. And recognizing the effort that takes, and sometimes how that can feel overwhelming when we have all of these other priorities or all of the other things on our plate as just not just educators, but humans. I think that can also be powerful. So before we talk about generative thinking and kind of continue that idea, I want to go back to something that you talked about with this team, right? This committee that is really taking that ownership, which is also powerful. I hear this, and I've heard this a lot as well, and I see this in the research. You kind of have to start small before you go big, and that's definitely what that team does. They focus, but you talked about developing common language and expectations. I see this overlooked so often. And oftentimes it's because they don't know how to do so. So what would you say for our listeners who have identified, oh yeah, we don't have a common language. We don't expectations. I mean, I have expectations, but I think they're different than other people's. So if we were to come together and develop some common expectations
Mhm.
of language, how does it happen?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would suggest that that leadership team, start by drafting some ideas, right? Get some things down in draft, but it doesn't end there. I would kick off my year with a meeting with teachers and share those, but set up some kind of activity where maybe it's a carousel brainstorm where people are adding their thoughts or edits, so that when you leave that room, everybody agrees, right? This is what the time commitment is. This is my role as a teacher. This is what I can expect of my coach. This is what I can expect of my leader. These are the student outcomes that we're focused on this year. There's a lot of outcomes, but let's prioritize these. So what are the priorities? And get all of that out, and then post it, revisit it. There's lots of staff meetings during the year. They may be short, but there's time to come back to those defined terms and expectations, and also revise, reflect, revise. That's part of improvement. Maybe something's not working, right? There's some interruption in the coach's time, and they're not able to do what originally was defined as their role. And so being able to talk about that and refine the practice. But it's just like we do with the kids, right? When they come in the beginning of the year, we talk about what the procedures are, we post those and we practice them. And that's when things move from our short-term memory into our long-term memory and become part of our natural, normal behavior and conversations.
Yeah. And then we revisit it around Halloween and the holidays and after winter break. But I mean, absolutely. I do think that, takes a little bit of pressure off and also supports this kind of iterative change, which, having a strong plan is important, but we know that the best laid plans don't always pan out exactly how we had planned. So we've got to be open. And I think that, again, I love this idea of having a team who really is in charge of this, that can focus, that can go back and, understand that the language and the expectations that they maybe set forth in the beginning may need to adapt and adjust as the year goes on. I mean, take the past few years as a perfect example. Coaches who are, because of absolute need, not coaching as much as they're in the classroom and subbing and taking on extra responsibilities to take something off teachers' plates. And that's important work that they are doing this year. And hopefully it's short term, but that does adjust things, that changes the expectations, changes maybe how we talk about the role of a coach for this year. So I think that's important. I
That's
love
right. That you make a good point in that those roles and definitions may change from year to year,
that. Mhm.
especially when we're in a crisis year or a year where we
Right,
can't staff classrooms or we can't get substitutes.
right.
So I agree with you that it's, you may have to revisit those. And I'm with you on the let's hope we get back to real student centered and very powerful pedagogy around
Mhm.
learning.
Yeah, I even think as districts bring in additional support roles, right? Coordinators and specialists, maybe they've hired a literacy specialist. How does that individual fit into the triangle now with our coach, our administrator, and our teacher? How do we make sure that the coach and the specialist work collaboratively together to support those teachers? And how does the teacher know which one to reach out to, or the administrator? So even as we bring additional players onto the field in our organizations, really thinking about how does this change? Hopefully those additional players can strengthen the existing partnerships, even help our coaches focus more on that teacher support piece. So, all right, so let's go back to generative thinking. Can you define generative thinking just for a few folks who that term may be new for? And then let's talk a little bit about what it means to embrace generative thinking.
Yeah. So, you might think of generative thinking as kind of parallel to almost mindset, right? That you're going to have open, like it's open mindset, open responses. And so we just have a tendency, most coaches are experts, or they wouldn't be in their role, right? They become experts in literacy or math or just academics in general. And it's just, and leaders are experts. They've also, had their career path and developed a lot of expertise around leadership. And it's so easy to give the answer, right? Because we see it. We may see non-engagement in the classroom. We may see some transition challenges that are taking time away from the classroom instruction. We may see opportunities to do informal assessment to determine whether students learned or not, and their missed opportunities. We know, often what needs to happen. And we just have got to resist jumping in and giving the answer, because in that way, you're not generating thinking, right? We really want the learner, the coachee, to generate the thinking. And you can do a parallel to this with students. It's the same thing we want students to do. We don't want to tell students the answer. We want them to come up with the answer, to research the answer, to look for evidence in their text that points to the answer. And so it's that, and that's makes it even more powerful, because if we're using responses and questions and dialogue and setting up conversations that are open-ended and generate thinking, then we are also going to have that behavior with our students. So it's a very powerful thing. We know some examples of open-ended statements. So we're going to respond with, what did you notice? Can you think of other ways that you might have done this lesson? What are the reasons why you observed X, Y, and Z? And so I use something called, in my book, The Coaching Partnership, called the EASY framework. And it helps drive these conversations to generate thinking. So if I could, I'd love to share a little bit of that framework with you. I think we have a...
Yeah, we've got this one here.
Okay, so EASY is an acronym, EASY. And so it always begins with the evidence, the E for evidence. And I'll talk you through a little bit more of this. And then the A is for analysis, S, solutions to explore, and Y, yes, agreements. So beginning with the evidence, we will always ask the teachers questions, or the learners questions about, what was most effective? Did you meet your learning outcomes? How do you know? How do you know? Coming back to that, how do you know? Which points us to something the students said, right? Something the student, a way that the students responded, an artifact of writing, an artifact of how students read aloud, how they answered questions. So we begin always and point always to that evidence. And I love it because it takes the focus so much off the teacher behavior and puts it back to students actually learn. So once we've identified the evidence and we move toward that analysis. So what does this tell us, right? As we're looking at these artifacts of student work, or reviewing how they responded to questions, or how well they did the informal assessment. What did the informal assessment tell us, whether it was an exit slip or whatever it was? So what did we learn from that? So we dive a little bit deeper into that and asking questions around that evidence. And then that should lead us to solutions to explore. And I love to think about these solutions as kind of co-constructing strength-based actions, right? If you remember that, co-constructing strength-based actions. So it's not just the coach constructing what we're going to do. It's a co-construction of this. So the conversation then leads to, okay, well, what solutions could we explore? What's worked for you in the past? What's something maybe you've seen some of your colleagues do? Because oftentimes teachers will have done certain strategies or pedagogical practices in their past, and they just didn't do it in the moment, right? We all forget. You mentioned that Halloween and, Thanksgiving, Christmas revisiting, so, oh yeah, I used to do that. So generating that pool of solutions together, so co-constructing, and then we can't do them all, right? Generally, we'll generate 2 or 3 or 4. And so I think the yes, then the why, the final step is, okay, what can we actually try before I come back? Or what will we do? Maybe the coach is going to come in and model. Maybe that's the step that we take.
Right.
So this, I think, is a really good example of how you generate thinking rather than giving someone the answer.
And I love that this kind of takes us from evidence, right? Some type of an artifact, objective artifact that we can look at. And, here is where I definitely plug the use of video in that. I mean, if we could, if we've used video so that we can listen to what that student said, whether that coach was in that classroom or not, really kind of going back and hearing that objectively is going to be really powerful. It's one of the main reasons I love to use video in my coaching, because it really does allow me to better embrace that this generative conversation. Otherwise, I'm spending my time trying to help the teacher remember, or they're struggling recalling, and then I feel this urgency start to bubble up, and I'm like, well, what if we try this? Like I jump right to possible solutions, and that co-creation's out the window. So I think if we really have like some good artifacts of evidence, that then we can really set ourselves up for success. But I love it that it takes us from evidence to kind of this reflective conversation, this generative thinking. Again, we're always balancing this act between, I think Jim Knight calls it advocacy and inquiry, or, kind of building that capacity with our teacher, but also supporting them. And I know there's many coaches out there and many who still do feel like, well, I'm a coach. I think I'm supposed to come in as the expert. That was my first fail as a coach. My first time coaching was, oh, okay, I was hired as a coach, right? Plucked out of the classroom to support others because I'm doing something well. But that doesn't really work. That at the best creates some short-term change with teachers, but not long-term.
No.
And the long-term really is where we change behaviors, is when we start to shift mindsets. We ask teachers to think more than we ask them to do, right?
Right.
So
that's adult learning, right? That's how we learn. We have to buy in. We have to reflect. We have to practice. So if we leave all those things out, then we won't get the change.
And there's a growing amount of research that especially talks about this generation of students who really require the same thing. So inherently modeling that, as you were talking about, through this process, I think is really powerful. But I love the EASY acronym, because I do think this is a great visual as we think about generative thinking. But I also, my favorite part of this, I think, more than reflection, which is surprising because I'm a big fan of reflection, is really the next steps, right? Those yes agreements. What are we going to take then and try? And is it something that you feel comfortable trying on your own? And then we'll come back and talk about it again and kind of do the process over. Or do you need support? Should I come in and co-teach or model? Or do we need to plan that together so you feel successful and supported taking that next step? And I think that's an important conversation. I try not to leave any coaching session or conversation without talking about those next steps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one more point on evidence. I was thinking, as you were talking about, if we have the luxury of a pre-conference or going in or before filming, whatever we're doing, we can ask, what evidence would you like me to look for, right?
Yes.
Do some questions. Maybe the teacher would like to know how many students are raising their hands to answer questions, right? Who's raising their hand? Who's not raising their hand? Things like that we can do some quick tallies of, and then bring that collectively back to discuss. So let's not forget to ask the teacher about what would they like us to watch for, look for, and gather while we're either watching the video or actually in the room.
Yeah. And I think there's also something there as well, especially I love that you call it a luxury, because it really is a luxury. Those pre-coaching, those pre-observation questions, pre-conference questions or opportunities don't always happen. So then we just kind of find ourselves in this pop-in cycle that doesn't always feel as productive. But it also supports the teachers, I've found, in learning how to start to collect their own evidence, right? Which helps them become more responsive on their own. Again, this idea of building that capacity. If I have the idea that I might want to look at my wait time or my questioning, and as I'm working with my coach, they're also showing me, how do I collect evidence around that? What's the best way to kind of collect that data so then I can appropriately analyze it? That's a powerful capacity building step as well. That's kind of, again, just built into this model. So speaking of next steps, final question for you today is, what are some of the next steps that coaches or other instructional leaders can really take to start to initiate not just this partnership coaching, not just initiate it, but really sustain it and kind of have that systemic partnership in their organization?
Yeah, this kind of circles back to the beginning of our conversation, because you've heard it said before that it's a failure to plan is a plan to fail. So we have to take that time to plan that year, and that leadership committee, that learning leadership committee or coaching culture committee, whatever you want to call it, making sure that team is in place and that they have a schedule to meet regularly, and that is held sacrosanct, so to speak, right? Like they don't deviate from that. And then there's so many things that team has to talk about. So they need to talk about, what's the learning environment like? What's our curriculum like? Boy, I need more coffee, I think. Right? What are the roles? How are we generating thinking? What about the relationships? Have we built trust? Are we using academic language? Is that something that we need to work on this year? What are our communication structures? When are we going to look at data? Like all those things. And there's a tool in the book called the Coaching Systems Planning Tool that kind of is just a list of these things. And so for all of these things, what is the leader role? What is the coach role? What is the learner role, the teacher role? And you just really have to plan and revisit and go through these things to make your system, to make this partnership systematic and the coaching partnership really work. So it's hard, like you said before, it's hard work.
Yeah.
But I think it's well worth the time, and to create that culture where we are learners as educators, and that that's going to make our students better and achieve what we're really all in it for, right? Is achievement.
Well, and I think this is, so first of all, I want to make sure that folks know, and especially those who are listening in the podcast, you can access our notes and takeaways from today's episode either at learn.sibme.com, or if you've signed up to get our weekly emails about our episodes, and those episodes emailed directly to you, your takeaways come to you as well. So you'll be able to access the book that Carol is talking about, as well as that visual that we were showing for generative thinking, and some other amazing links and resources around this. But I also, want to say, like, what great timing right now, because it does, like, that committee actually has some front loading to
Mhm.
do. And this is the perfect time as we think about, the April, and as our coaching maybe slows down. So if we are those coaches, those instructional leaders that, are really have not found a lot of success in their instructional coaching or their program, or are looking to start that next year, this is a great time to you need to sprint load this part. And so this semester, even some time into this summer, really being able to give space for those conversations and that development to start to take place so you can kick off your new year with that. It's also a good time just to try out a couple of these things. Let me see how this language or how these expectations sit with another group of teachers that we kind of go and kind of introduce it to, right? So let's get some test groups kind of maybe going along the way. This is, again, a really great time of year to do that. So such a timely time to have you on, Carol. It's been
Well, thank
awesome.
you. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Yeah. So again, I love this idea. I am this is my philosophical approach to coaching, right? This kind of partnership piece, and really, again, I think my favorite thing from today's episode, besides some of the concrete how do we do this, is I really love your easy acronym for generative thinking, and just that reminder to embrace it, to get comfortable sitting in that uncomfortable space. You may have the answer, you may know the next best possible solution, and your teacher may pick a different one that you've co-created. But that's okay, right? It's about the journey, not always just that destination with our teachers. So that's powerful. All right, Carol, anything else for our audience before we end our episode for today?
I just want to thank them for their hard work out there. I know they're out there every day making the difference for our kids, and I'm so grateful to the hard work that's done in those classrooms and in those school buildings every day by the leaders, the coaches, and the teachers and the staff. So
Yeah.
thank you for what you do.
Yeah, especially these past few years as we've all together been overwhelmed and exhausted and dealing through the pandemic crisis and lifting others up. I think our coaches' roles have been very different the past few years, but vital for our teachers and our students. So, yeah. Well, Carol, we'll hopefully have you on again for another episode here on the Coach Replay Show. This was amazing. Be sure again to download the notes and takeaways so you can access all of Carol's resources, including her book, and check out her blogs, especially the content that Scholastic puts out. Again, amazing content. I use it a lot in my coaching as well. And be sure to like, follow, and subscribe so you don't miss another episode. Thanks again for joining today, Carol.
Thank you.
All right. See you all next week.